From 10,000 feet, a metropolis can be seen as an anonymous and daunting thing. It can seem like a massive collection of buildings and roads, more of a complex piece of machinery than the home to millions of people with individual lives and destinies. But great cities actually are, of course, places with unique personalities, multitude of personalities, of course. And it's often thought that these personalities simply happen on their own, and that sometimes and mostly it's done by some kind of organic chance. But modern metropolises actually can increase the odds on having these kinds of places, and they can do it through smart planning. Looking at the best examples from other places, understanding the role of architecture and design in building unique pockets in a metropolis, you might call it kind of building a neighborhood at a time. Our next panel will explore how that happens, what cities are leading the neighborhood making process. And I'd like to introduce our panel now. Let me call first of all Joe Berridge, partner of Urban Strategies. David? Still looking young, he's marvelous. Moira Wilson, an urban designer from the city of Vaughan, the city above Toronto. Lauren Braithwaite, president and CEO of Build Toronto. I was with a panel on him yesterday, he's very smart. And John Campbell, the CEO of Waterfront Toronto. Great man, nice to see you. There we are, and as chair, we have a special chair. Our panel chair is from Washington, D.C. Would you please welcome Ron Bogle, the president and CEO of American Architecture Foundation.
Thanks, sir.
Nice to see you, sir. Ron, it's your panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Well, thanks for inviting us to be a part of this discussion. The morning session was dealing with some things at 30,000 feet. We're going to drive it on down and bring it home. We're going to talk about Toronto as a thriving community that we now all know is the fourth most livable city on the planet. We're going to talk about why that's important and where Toronto is going. But we're also going to talk about Toronto as a global petri dish, experimenting with new forms of the urban fabric and what can we learn from what you're doing, what you've done, and where you're going. So happy to be a part of this. And by the way, we're going to, from time to time, ask you all if you want to join us with some questions for the panel. I think I'd like to start off with Toronto, the fourth most livable city on the planet. How did that happen? Who wants to tackle that question?
John Campbell and I were at a conference in France, actually in Nice, several years ago. People used to come up to us and say, Toronto, that's the biggest city in the world that nobody's ever heard of. And there's a terrible truth to that, is our wonderfully polite and non-self-advancing Canadianness. But I think it largely happened by accident. It happened because there is a kind of, nobody planned that we were going to have the population of Montreal join us over the next 25 years. It just happened because of immigration. And I think if there's one thing that has made us a success, it actually is the successful accommodation of that immigrant experience, because these are levels of population growth that are actually developing world rather than developed world. We're way ahead of any other city in terms of how many people we bring in. And the fact that this works pretty well, not perfectly, but it works pretty well, I think is it's a consequence of the sort of general geniality and good-naturedness that's at the core of the culture of Toronto. And this has made the place work. If this didn't work, and Raoul gave us some good things to be worried about, and as Canadians we should always be worried, about little things and big things. That is, if the economy starts to falter, if those 150,000 people coming in can't get a job that satisfies them, then we're in trouble. But frankly, for the last 50 years, we've done it pretty well. And I think that's actually why we've got the ranking we've got.
So, Lauren, Joe says that where you are today is a bit of an accident. I would assume you don't agree with that entirely.
I would agree, not entirely. I think a lot of what he says makes sense, but there's a couple of major events that have happened to us politically in the last 25 years that have had a big impact on Toronto. And I'll mention two or three of them that might be helpful. The first one is many years ago, we had a situation in terms of the referendum in Quebec, And that led to a number of companies moving from Montreal to Toronto, and a tremendous amount of people and activity being centered in terms of growth in Toronto. Secondly, the free trade agreement. One of the big beneficiaries of the free trade agreement in Canada was not only Ontario and large, but specifically Toronto, and that was a big factor. And the last area that I would say is that if you look at the recent growth activity that's going on here, it is absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, there were, as of about 3 or 4 months ago, the last time I checked, there were something like 190 high-rise residential towers at various stages of approval and construction. That's the highest amount of any city in the world. And in fact, you can take the growth or the comparable number for New York, for Boston, for Chicago, for Los Angeles, and it's bigger than the growth of all 4 of those cities. So those 3 things are big factors in terms of getting us to where we are now. And yes, a certain amount of it was by good luck, if you will, as opposed to good management. There were some component parts of how our country has come together that's had a big positive impact.
I think as well, Joe, we've said this before, in the sense that the master plan that was put in place in the, early 70s, when you were at planning and
David Crombie was mayor?
David Crombie was the mayor, actually helped reshape the city as well. I mean, when you compare the city today, it's a downtown, very, livable city, whereas a lot of cities have had the cores hollow out. You only have office, you have residents in the suburbs, where I think we've been working since the 70s on really reinforcing residential downtown, which has, I think, really helped and made us a 24-hour-a-day city.
So, Maura, as an urban designer, is the metropolitan area preparing itself to be able to accommodate this growth in a way that maintains its status as a great livable metropolitan region?
Yes, in short, I think the many of the designers who live in Toronto or internationally are actually now starting to work a lot in the 905, the outer areas, Markham, Mississauga, Vaughan, and these are the areas that we're beginning to think regionally now, or the mega region, not just the city. Even though we all operate as municipalities and there's a certain amount of competition, I think our strength and our future and the potential is to think on a regional scale to solve a lot of the social, environmental imperatives that we have to face. So I think in terms of the design, there's a great sense of optimism. I'm part of project managing urban design projects in our new downtown, the Vaughan Metropolitan Centre, which will be linked to Toronto by the subway and be linked also by light bus rapid transit along Highway 7 from Markham over to Vaughan. So there's a great sense of learning and looking at precedents, but also realizing that we have a completely almost unprecedented opportunity to design and build and work together with the partners in the development industry to build a place that really speaks to the future in terms of environmental and how to social inclusivity and participation and the quirks of local culture, what breeds cultural or urban difference. So the fact that we have, for example, Mario and Rocco have grew tomatoes and rapini at a little crazy fragment by the Highway 407. How can we bring that into the planning of the city to breed diversity and interest and make it a place that has people feeling like they're part of something larger. So we have that sense of optimism, I would say.
So there's a city in the United States called Portland. For those of you who are not familiar with the U.S., it's south of Vancouver. That was intended as humor. Several years ago, decades ago, they decided rather than build another highway exchange, they would take that money and design and build a bicycle infrastructure. And at that time, you couldn't differentiate Portland from any other city in the United States as regards to cycle usage. And now it is, if not the highest cycle usage in the country, it's among the highest. This is an example, maybe a rare example, of if you build it, they will come. But leadership made a decision to make an investment that really fundamentally changed the way that Portland thinks about itself and how it moves itself around. An important engagement with citizens as well. And citizen engagement, feeling like they're part of the larger future of the community, is one of the charges of this panel, is to explore and discuss how do we involve citizens in a meaningful way so they can be a part of deciding the future of the city.
Yeah, I think it's easy to understand how you do that at the local level. And Toronto has been very good at having a lot of community engagement to try and sort out local issues. It's really tough to know how you have a conversation about a regional transit system, which is the thing that we're struggling with right now. And it is interesting that the province, and one should never underestimate the role of the province in sort of being big daddy over the whole region, I think very successfully. They implemented a growth plan about half a dozen years ago, and essentially they got it through by talking everybody to death. People were so bored that they said, yeah, please pass the growth plan, we can't stand talking about it anymore. I hope we're getting to that point on transit. Everybody's so sick of talking about it, yes, tax me. And so that's... I'm looking forward to it.
Well, it's very interesting. Like, we have a lot of public consultation in the waterfront. We have something like over 200 public meetings in the last 7 years. But I echo Joe's point. It's very hard to do a broader reach. I mean, we're building a new waterfront, not just for the neighbors, but for the city, for the province, and the nation. I mean, all three are paying for it. So it's a real challenge to get that message out and to get engagement on bigger issues. It's very, very difficult, particularly the new immigrants and young people. Mm-hmm. So we're trying again to use social media and new venues, new avenues to try to reach out beyond the neighbors.
So, Moya, well, just go ahead, sir.
Sorry, I'm just going to add to John's comment about the engagement and the participation is important in terms of getting a feel for the politic and the people. But another key element of it, someone has to show leadership and take a direction, make a decision, and live with the decision and make it happen. And I think that we're part way through the engagement process in terms of our public transportation, and we're all becoming more knowledgeable. But we're entering that very key stage where someone has to strike out and show leadership. And one of the key elements that I would suggest as an idea is figure out as close as you can the beneficiaries of a big regional transportation system, and take that and divide up the component parts and on a percentage basis. And I'm sure a certain amount of it is going to be user fees. Another certain amount is going to come from the province. The Fred should participate as well and show leadership and make it happen.
So you're suggesting that you can't take the entire metropolitan area in one bite. You have to break it into smaller components and have leadership in those components?
Well, I'm saying that you gotta figure out. I mean, this city kind of leads this country.
Okay.
It's the largest city, and there's many benefits for this city to continue to be ranked among the top 10 cities in the world. So as a country, we need to be cognizant of that and participate in terms of how it's funded. And the same thing applies provincially, and the same thing applies the city itself, and then right down to various regional municipalities. So someone's got to, once the ownership, once the knowledge level is up, someone's got to take a leadership position and say, this is where we got to go.
So leadership,
So
but also...
maybe David Crombie could help
David,
fulfill that role.
would you take a tax issue out and get it passed? Okay, great. There's your guy. So leadership on one, leadership on one hand, but I think philosophically we all believe that it's leadership in partnership with citizens, with the community that it serves. In your experience, are there ways now that we're engaging citizens in more innovative and more exciting ways than just the town meeting?
I think we're just on the cusp of that, to be honest. I think we are with the new digital mobile devices we have and social media networks. We're just beginning to have a new generation that's transformed from sort of passive recipients of government services to active, involved participants, citizens that actually feel like they are city makers, culture makers, and also caretakers of the city. So, the phenomenon of someone takes a picture of a sleeping TTC bus driver, well, you know what, that could also be a positive thing in that as these networks, open source and crowdsourcing networks emerge, which they already are, as those get mobilized and used by cities and regional, provincial level governments as well, it'll be a way of citizens to actually feel like they they have more control over city making. So right now they voice opposition because that's the only kind of control they have, is to show up at a public meeting and sort of say no, 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 versus if they're involved earlier and in a more flexible way. I think that's the future of the public process.
Moira raises a very interesting point, because I think the social media, it does give us a new way. I think Mary this morning called it the democratization of planning, which I think is a very positive thing, because there is also a risk that at the local meeting, as Moira says, the objectors come out, or the people with a very, very strong point of view, and so you may get a somewhat slanted point of view. You don't get the broader point of view, which you can get through the new processes.
John, I'd like to challenge you on that point. In fact, having professional planners is the base core that what we're doing, it makes sense, that it takes under consideration the history of how the region has come together, et cetera. And then the political side still has to make the decision. And sometimes the political side will agree with planning, sometimes they will disagree with planning. I think if you let planning get involved in the political side, you're losing one of the key elements of what represents good decision making and good governance in terms of how we operate as a society.
I'm not sure I quite agree, but I think having professional planners is critical, having a vision is critical, but I think having broader input to decisions, I think, and the input and understanding how the public feels abroad is an important element in the political process.
Let me give an example of how I think that comes together, because I don't think it's actually the difference. I work a lot in the UK, so I have an Oyster card, which is the London Underground Presto card. As a result, I get a blizzard of emails telling me about where there's an interruption on the Jubilee line, and that I can get a 2-for-1 deal at some restaurant served on the District line. And during the Olympics, it was just extraordinary the amount of information that I was receiving on, if I had been in London, how I was to manage myself around the town. What that made me feel was part of a community, even though I'm many thousand miles away, that never existed before. It was a community of people who use the transit in that city. And I think this is a fantastic way of turning kind of passive folk commuters into active participants in their transit experience. And this allows planners then a lot of freedom, because they can actually put out questions. Mm-hmm. What kind of Sunday service do you think makes sense? What happens? Should the line go there? Should the line go there? This is something that's never been done before, and it also creates this consistency, which the political leaders have incredibly sensitive eyes and ears, and they can feel that pulse, and that will give them the confidence they need to make the tough decisions we have to make here.
So, in fact, it's our theory at the American Architectural Foundation that there are three elements that drive change in cities. There used to be two, maybe more, but there are three we identify. One is public policy, the political leadership. Mm-hmm. Two is design, the shape of the physical environment. But three, the new player is technology. And our IBM presentation today really introduced that eloquently. Let's see if there's anyone in the audience that would like to ask a question of the panel or join this conversation. We can see you a little bit, but I can't really see you well enough to even see a hand go up.
Here's one right here.
Yes. I think there's a microphone coming around. Is there?
Well, not all show.
Microphone?
There you go.
I would just say that over here.
The one common thing that I've sort of caught so far this morning, which was just mentioned recently, and that was the word pulse. And this is something that politically in the past, every politician or planner has tried to anticipate or predict what that pulse is in terms of the public interest. And it was either good planning, or it was a guessing game, or it was a big mistake. Yeah. But now, as John Campbell's saying about all the endless public meetings for waterfront projects, which would seem overkill, the whole point is to really find out what that pulse is. And because of the advent of social media and technology, there's an overflow of information, but what it does do is, if that data can be managed, as we saw with the IBM presentation, there's a better opportunity for confidence that the pulse is being read properly. Whereas before, people were just passive. They just accepted what the planners told them the city was going to be, and people loved it or hated it. and then you see the results of either, in the case of Toronto being maybe a good city that maybe happened by accident, which we know Robert Fulford's book about, but whereas in American cities, they went from being great, and some of them, fell apart. And we're scratching our heads finding out, well, what went wrong? Well, the pulse was missed. Something was missed. And so with all this data that we have now, there's a better opportunity to really build and react fast based on that data to really get what that pulse is.
So, in a way, we have a new asset. And the asset is data, information, the ability to engage with people in real time on what they're experiencing and how they're experiencing it.
Yeah, we had this, I think there was a very real-time situation we had a couple of years ago when Waterfront Toronto had a plan for the waterfront, for the Portlands area of the waterfront. The mayor came in with an alternative plan, and suddenly the pulse of the city went up like this, and there was a big reaction to that. And which couldn't have happened if social media, et cetera, hadn't. But at the same time, I think, interestingly, to Lauren's point, there is a need to have professional planning. So a city is not a place where you can. It's an endless sort of box of delights. You can only have what you can afford. And so I think it actually gave a useful opportunity to say, well, maybe what we were thinking about before was not actually something that we were completely able to do, or we hadn't thought it through enough. So it's this tension, I think, between you can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need. And that political process has to take you through that, and planners have to provide the kind of objectivity in that dialogue, because without that, nothing actually serious will happen.
I'd like to also address the gentleman's question more directly as well, in the sense that we're working with IBM and Element Blue, one of their partners, to develop analytics. So when we get all the information coming in, you can actually, I can't read 300 visits on the email a year that we get, but we can use the analytics to then boil it down to figure out what is the pulse, what are the views of people. Again, to Lauren's point, I mean, it isn't, to Joe's point, it's not a question of here's a candy box, what do you like? I mean, there has to be professional planners, a vision, a real policy focus on how you get to solve some of these challenges that Jennifer mentioned this morning, but you've got to bring the public along with it as well.
Yeah, just an add-on that's related to that. I mean, diversity in terms of board, diversity in terms of ideas, all is a positive factor. Having said that, you still need the on-the-ground professionals in terms of the planners and even in terms of development activity that you can look through that data and basically come up with a forward-looking and a forward program that everybody is comfortable with, that represents leadership on a world scale. And we're now competing worldwide. This is not just North America. We're now we're ranked in the top 10 cities in the world, and that's a huge plus. And kudos to everybody that participated and enabled us to get this far.
Let's do a rapid fire. What's the number one challenge over the next decade facing the metropolitan area? What's the one thing you have to do right?
I would say integrating mobility in the urban fabric.
Integrating
is
mobility?
our most pressing, whatever form that is, whether it's using human locomotion, but I think that is our most pressing urgent need.
I would throw out job creation.
I think the long term is getting the right housing stock downtown.
Say that again.
The long term is getting the right housing stock. I mean, Jennifer talked about this bifurcation of the city. You've got the rich, or Raul talked about as well, and the not so rich. How do you get the housing stock so you can afford to have a mix of people in the downtown?
John, when you retire, you and your wife will fit nicely into a 400 square foot.
Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of. And bunk beds.
And I'll be in the one next door.
It's a sad future, isn't it?
I think, and it was touched on before, we're not paying enough for the city that we need. So we do have to figure out how we create the wealth through taxation and through
You
job
solved
creation.
that with David, right? You're going to lead the tax drive. Yeah. Okay.
Well, it's fascinating to me what's going on in the U.S. That when Orange County Probably one of the most right-wing counties, Republican counties.
Correction, the most right wing.
That's, yeah, it is. It can approve a sales tax of 1%, I think, with a 66% margin. I mean, that is showing people there have woken up to the fact you can't get stuff for free. You have to pay for it, and we need to make the investments. When you look at this town and you look at the infrastructure that the Victorians built and that the interwar period and the immediate post-war period, I mean, this was solid stuff that the whole city is based on, and we need to start doing that again.
Yeah, we focus a lot on transit, and that is one of the solutions, and I think it's an essential. But there are other ways as well. When you look at what Jennifer talked about this morning, I think you have transit really is a way of bringing people into work more efficiently. But it's still based on a post-war car-type city. So I think the other solution is bringing the work to the people with broadband. That's another key element, I think, of technology going forward to solve this issue. And lastly, is getting the right mix downtown in these areas so you can actually live, work. Not that, again, John pointed out this morning, not everybody can live, work in the same spot because we live in very complicated lives. But providing some of those opportunities to make sure that people have jobs where the talent pool is.
Let's go back to the audience. We saw some other hands, yes?
Could each of the panelists comment on environmental issues for the city of the future? I would have thought that would have been first on everybody's list.
Well, it was. We're actually going to wrap up with that, but since you asked, we'll go ahead and do that.
Well, thanks, no problem.
So let's talk about the environmental status of Toronto, the metropolitan area. Where's the environmental health of the city?
Well, the fact is, cities are environmentally healthy. And they are the most efficient use of resources. And I'm a great fan of the guy who wrote the article in the New Yorker, sitting in his apartment on 2nd Avenue, without a car, with a subway underneath thing, saying in an apartment building, saying, I'm the most. I don't know, go and live in the country in a straw-baled house, eating mung beans. I am actually the most environmentally sensitive person living in a big city, and I think that's the fundamental thing. I find often an irritating disconnect between environmentalists who I think are part of their DNA is anti-urban, and in fact what we have to do in cities, which is to make people live at higher densities, more intense, less car use, more pedestrian. And that's actually the most sustainable thing we could do.
So true enough. Per capita, cities are better for the environment, but also buildings produce more greenhouse gas than any other source. So we're dealing with a balance here. In China, for example, many of you know Beijing is having enormous problems because of some mistakes they made a few decades ago. And recently the minister for the Ministry of Housing, Urban and Rural Development said, we spent 10 years getting Beijing population off of bicycles, and now we're going to spend the next 10 years getting them back on bicycles. So cities have to deal with these issues, and some of that is through public transportation. It's through transportation.
But I also have to say, in response, I'm glad you asked that because what equally flashed in my mind as an equal issue to what my answer. I could have given probably 5 answers to that flash round. But the one thing about the cities that were the new cities, I guess, or the edge cities, the new urban centers that we're building in the 905, at least for the Vaughan Metropolitan Center, we know that it's an imperative there is an environmental imperative that also makes economic sense in the sense, we have to how do we integrate emerging forms of technology and ways to capture and harvest energy, to manage our streets. So instead of just planting shrubs that we clip and high maintenance, high input street plantings, we're actually looking at innovative ways to our street plantings just in select pilot project streets that will be lower input, that will be kind of link us to the larger regional system. And we know that we have to think on a regional scale to solve a lot of these watershed issues, forest cover, all those kind of things as well. So I think it's a very obviously a pertinent point when we talk about what are the elements of the future metropolis.
Much of our middle-income families are really struggling in the last 5 years, which was raised by the earlier panel. And historically, we've always addressed that issue by trying to figure out ways to grow their income and make it that their standard of living is easier, if you will, in the overall spectrum of income levels. In fact, the one thing that we often don't look at is there an opportunity to take their current income with some increase, but help them out on their cost of living side. And I think that's part of what's going on right now in our society, where you look at the number of high-rise buildings. In fact, the mantra of many of the developers on the residential side and the mantra of many of the young people is live, work, and play, eliminate the commute. So don't live with 2 cars. Don't even live with 1 car. Rent a car on the weekend. In other words, a totally different lifestyle that in fact will reduce their cost of living in terms of the dollars they need to live, and yet they're living in a happy environment, which was also raised in the earlier panel, because they in fact can walk to work, they can walk for groceries. In other words, they have a much different lifestyle, and yet they like a lot of the amenities that are part of the urban fabric, and they're still able to participate without having two cars and driving here, there, and everywhere.
And we're building those kinds of communities in the waterfront. I think one of the challenges we took on as a core value was sustainability for the environment. And so we're looking at how we build buildings that are LEED Gold, for example, that have what we call our minimum green building requirements, green roofs, those kinds of things. We have a unique advantage because we control public land. So developers who buy land from us have to comply with those kinds of issues. So for us, it's critical that stuff gets built in a way that is looking at the long term. For example, one of the things we're doing is introduce what I call structural flexibility. Right now we're building these 500 units, my wife and I and my neighbor is going to live in, but they're built with shear walls. And those 500 square units will be 500 square units forever. That doesn't make any sense. So how do we have a situation, how do we create a policy whereby you provide a certain minimum number of units that have punch outs so you can combine units? Or in the future you build with no shear walls, like you build office buildings, to allow people to buy their neighbor's unit when they stay and have a family. So you're looking at ways of trying to make sure that you can have the city grow, have that lifestyle that Lauren talked about, but let people mature through their whole life cycle in an urban area.
Let's go back to the audience. Over here. I can only see the front row, so
Yeah.
the rest of you are lost. I'm sorry.
I'm getting a tan in here.
There's one up here.
There's another back there. Let's do 2, and then we'll bring it back to the panel.
All right. I got the mic first.
Who has the mic?
Right over here.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Dennis Rack, and I represent the Avondale.
I guess not.
Not on? Can we not hear?
So we have 2 people with mics.
All right. I'm going to take the lead on this back here.
Folks. So this guy back in the back. So what's your name, sir?
Steve,
Hi, Steve.
you've talked about community engagement, and I think the City of Toronto does that really well. All the development projects across the city, the neighborhoods are all engaged with the planning department. I think the one criticism I would have is we don't do a very good job on managing expectations. Question to you is, are there examples of community engagement where they've managed the community's expectations? Point in case, a while back, Spadina and Bloor. There was a project that they were looking at having a tower located at a major intersection of a subway hub, and the developer decided to say, forget the community, I'm not going to the board, I'm just going to build townhomes, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. In a major city like Toronto and across the world, I have a hard time believing that there are single-family homes right at a major hubway stop like that. So have you got any examples that you can provide us where community engagement has
In the interest of
managed?
time, rather than everybody responding, let's just get one
Yeah.
response.
I live next to those townhomes, so I know it was a travesty, I agree. A very quick answer, and I think you heard some allusions on to this on the earlier panel from Brian Tuckey from BUILD, the Development Industry Association. If you want development on the avenues at mobility hubs, you are going to have to change the balance of presumption about height and density and community expectation in favor of intensification. Because otherwise you get the kind of anomalous result that you're describing there. And this is a tough thing to do because nobody likes this. But if you're going to spend on the Eglinton line $4.4 billion on going across town Toronto, you'd better have some development sparked by that. And you can't allow a local resident free-for-all to oppose it.
Yes, good morning. My name is Dennis Rack. And I'd like to just point out that reference has been made several times to Toronto as the fourth best or most livable place to live in the world. Is it equally the fourth best place to do business? My question is, are our professional planners also planning in order to accommodate the amount of future economic activity that will be needed to sustain our highly livable status?
Who wants to take that?
I'm not a planner, I'm an urban designer, but I do know, for example, in the city of Vaughan, and don't quote me on this number, but I believe we have a lot of small businesses. I think 67% of our businesses are under 10 people in Vaughan. So there's a lot of entrepreneurship and small businesses. So the Economic Development Department, the Development Plan Department, we recognize that growth and try to support that growth. So for example, in the Vaughan Metropolitan Center, we're really at the beginning of this city project, but we're looking at ways of how do we incubate and support those small businesses, and what innovative forms does that take? Is it kiosks that are modular kiosks that are can be rented out, or is it getting in this sort of Center for Social Innovation type model of the business incubators where you lease space? And then you can expand or contract how much space you take up. So that is definitely one of the issues that we're thinking of in our
So
city.
let's take one more question from the audience, and then I'd like to spend the last 5 minutes kind of stepping back and looking at Toronto as a model city for others to learn from. What are the messages that Toronto can tell other cities that are dealing with urban growth and so forth? But first, back to the floor.
Hi, Sophie Knowles from Ryerson. My question is to do with the public realm and in the downtown. So as you know, our downtown area is growing faster than the surrounding regions of Toronto. And in this growing population of the downtown, what strategies would you propose to expand the public realm and ensure that it continues to be a great place for people to locate?
Maybe I could take a crack at that. One of the elements of the mandate of Build Toronto is to get very supportive and proactive in terms of city building, in terms of what can you contribute to the livability, to the public realm, et cetera, so that it isn't just the almighty dollar in terms of the returns that you're getting. And in the process of doing that, one of the things that we've run across is we take many projects that other people will not tackle for a whole variety of reasons, where they're high risk, there's environmental or whatever. And we have a philosophy that good projects enable significant city building, city realm contributions, and so on. And in the short 4 years plus that this Build Toronto organization has operated, we've had some really outstanding successes on that city building front. So the underlying philosophy or theory is produce and conceptualize a successful project, and part of that success includes significant contribution to the public realm, to city building, et cetera.
So now we're turning this audience into a group of civic leaders from around the world. They've all come to hear you talk about Toronto so they can learn the stories that they can take back home to apply to their cities. And they have 3 questions for you, and we have 3 minutes to answer them. 1, what is something that Toronto has done really well that you think is a message that needs to be told? Number 2, is there something that Toronto has done that you wish you had done it differently? And 3, do you have the mechanisms in place to go forward and continue to build on the success that you've established to date? Who wants to take the first question? What's the most important message from Toronto in terms of what you've done right?
Peace, order, and good government. I mean, it just a kind of. I honestly think what makes Toronto work is that it is it's a place that is very ordered, that likes to have a conversation about things. That there is a kind of almost inherent modesty even though we've created this great world city. And I actually think that's an enormous advantage. You go to so many cities that are so striving and so pushing. And oddly, the message here is almost relax, let it happen, let it grow organically, and actually it'll turn out okay. And I think it's a very tricky chemistry, but it seems to be the one that served us well.
It's the mix of everybody. That really made it work.
So number 2, every city makes mistakes. Is there something Toronto has done that you wish you had done it differently? Yep.
We sat in our hands on transit for 20 years, and we're way behind, and I think that's been a mistake.
Related to that, the extension of the Allen Expressway.
And the last question from our group of civic leaders is, do you have the mechanisms in place to build a great world city that will continue to enjoy the prosperity and quality of life that Toronto has today?
Well, I can comment on that. I mean, we put together 39 sites for Build Toronto over the last 4 years. And our top line revenue this year back to, that comes into the part of the city, because we are part of the city, we're owned 100% by the city, was in excess of $90 million. And this was land that was sitting in many cases dormant and not destined to be utilized in any significant way for many, many years.
Joe, is the infrastructure in place to go forward?
I actually think, I'm reasonably optimistic that this long transit debate is going to turn out okay. And I think then we'll get the habit of investing again, and it is a habit. You can see great cities around the world, London or Singapore, they've kind of figured out how to keep going and keep putting the next piece of transit or the next piece of great public realm in. 2015, when we have the Pan Am Games, when John's waterfront is going to look absolutely, it is going to shock people how wonderful the waterfront and the Pan Am Village and New Union Station all of a sudden are going to look quite extraordinary. And I think we're all going to say, wow, now we know what we've been doing and we'll be happy about spending more money.
So ladies and gentlemen, this has been a terrific panel. You all are brilliant. Appreciate your upbeat attitude. It looks like Toronto's future is great. There'll be a lot we can learn from you as you go forward and we all go forward. Thank you for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.